With a brand new Monster Hunter in the works, that being Monster Hunter Wilds, I thought it would be interesting to go over some potential changes I would like to see from this new Monster Hunter game. Because while a lot of the perspectives I have seen are from longtime fans of the series, I would consider myself relatively new to the series, as I first started playing Rise late summer of last year. And I think with Rise and World, I have about 250 hours total in Monster Hunter games. So I'm relatively new to Monster Hunter, and I quite like the Monster Hunter series. I started with Rise and am now currently going through the Iceborne expansion in World, and it has become one of my favorite PvE game series for its fighting game-like combat that has a lot of depth to it, and every individual monster feels very unique to engage with. But that's not to say the series is perfect, and I don't have any nostalgia in the way when looking at a new Monster Hunter game, because I'm too new to the series for that. So I'm giving a somewhat new player's perspective on things that annoyed me about playing through Rise and Sunbreak and World and now Iceborne, that I hope are addressed at least somewhat in Wilds. The first thing, I would not be upset if Wilds was not like this, but considering how it was set up in the initial trailer, I think it would be beneficial to the Monster Hunter series to incorporate a truly open world design, similar to how Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom is with its open world. I would like for Monster Hunter to be kind of like that. I know Monster Hunter World is kind of an open world game, but it's stitched together in kind of a semi-open world style, similar to Pokemon Legends Arceus, and how it's a pseudo-open world of sorts. I would prefer there to not be any seams in the open world experience, though. That would require a fair bit of mechanics changes, because primarily you would be experiencing the game in expedition mode, so to speak. So I think everything from your campsites to food buffs, as well as maybe obtaining gear, would have to take a considerable departure from the current Monster Hunter ideas in order to properly fit as an open world game. So in that sense, it would have to play a fair bit differently in order for those things to actually work properly. Another aspect that would probably have to change a fair bit for a fully open world design would be the story rails. I know that some open world games do get away with having a fair bit of story locking for certain regions or whatever. So I imagine something similar could also be done for Wilds if it is going to be a truly open world design. Personally, I don't find Monster Hunter stories engaging enough to want to have to sit through the rails, because Monster Hunter stories are not amazing. I played through Rise and Sunbreak and World, and I'm close to halfway through Iceborne, and like, it's fine, but it's mostly just a way to lock you out of progression. I feel like if they do plan to incorporate story rails, I think they should loosen those a little bit, especially for multiplayer aspects, because I know World is terrible when it comes to its handling of multiplayer, especially for like the first 10 or so hours of the game. If you're trying to play through World with friends, you're gonna have a hard time. You have to wait until you can unlock a certain amount of the game before multiplayer is even reasonably feasible. I think Rise did that far better. But Rise also barely had a story, so I guess that's the trade-off. World story's still not amazing either, so I would prefer less story rails just because I find them more annoying than anything else. Though probably the most annoying part of a Monster Hunter game is the grind, trying to get the proper equipment with the right decorations and talisman or whatever. There always seems to be some kind of annoying RNG mechanic that you have to just bang your head against until it finally gives you the right result. I hope Wilds does away with a lot of that, because that is unnecessarily obnoxious to have to go through. There's a reason there are a lot of mods to get past some of those things. I've seen forum threads where 200 hours into the game, they still don't have the gear they need for one build because the RNG is so bad. I don't think it should take that long for you to build out an optimized setup for a particular weapon. It's quite difficult for me to get a proper build because I play Gunlance, and Gunlance needs specific things to be viable against some of the higher tier monsters, especially in Master Rank, because it's too slow and clunky to be run mostly stock. I've seen when some people ask about what's the best way to farm when you're not like in the actual end game, what's the best way to get proper gear and stuff. And most of the responses I see is just play through the story and then worry about trying to get decorations and such. The problem with that is if you're using a weapon like Gunlance that absolutely needs stuff to get through the story, you're kind of stuck having to, play a different weapon basically, which I don't think that's quite fun. And I don't think it's really a problem in low rank and high rank. It's just Master Rank cranks up the difficulty a lot, and monsters are typically a lot faster. They chew through stamina on block way faster, so you need like max level constitution with evade window and evade extender just to make a Gunlance functional against these things. And that's not adding anything like artillery to boost your damage output. In World specifically, there's not an armor set that covers all of that. You can get an armor set that covers one, but you also have to fight a monster that Gunlance is pretty bad against because it's usually something really fast like Narakuga. And unless you're a really proficient Gunlance player, it's rough. I think the grind is way too absurd. You have to progress to basically beat the game before you can finally build out a proper Gunlance. And I find that mechanic quite frustrating, especially if you want to try to beat the whole story with a Gunlance. You have to have the skill level of a 1,000 hour player to do it, which I am not a speedrunner level player in Monster Hunter, so it's not something I can just do. So I've had to substitute with easier weapons. But I guess on the flip side, maybe the equipment progression would be more tolerable if Master Rank did not have such absurd difficulty scaling. Which I don't have a problem with games being hard. Playing through Iceborne has been quite a nice challenge, and there are several times where I have been completely stopped and have to take considerable amounts of time to learn the patterns of the monster just to be able to beat it in any reasonable capacity. I think that's fun, but I'd like to be able to obtain reasonable gear to make that a bit more convenient and not have to take out the hardest monsters in the game just to have gear to be able to take on those monsters more efficiently. I don't like the way that's set up. I'm sure a lot of veterans of the game really like how that's done, but I personally do not. I think building out your setup should be easier to do in the new game. Definitely easier than World. Rise was better about it, but it still kind of had that problem where, oh, you need this particular decoration for your really good build. You have to fight the final boss and hope you're good at the game. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time defeating it. That's why having good multiplayer helps, so that the people who are very experienced can help you take on those bigger monsters. But still, does it have to take that much effort? At the very least, get rid of most of the RNG. I would be pretty okay with just that. But moving on, I know I talked about multiplayer already, but I want to touch on it a bit more. Multiplayer should be a bit more seamless, especially than it is in World. I actually think it's fine in Rise. With the way Rise was set up, multiplayer works quite well with it. If Wilds is going to be a more open world game, I think it would make a lot of sense to, when you load the game up, to immediately have the option to set your game to single player or multiplayer. And if it's set to multiplayer, have the entire open world be set to multiplayer difficulty, just so that it's one thing that you set up your multiplayer lobby, your friends join or whatever, and then in an actual open world game, you run around and do whatever you want, and everything's already scaled to multiplayer just like that. I think that would make it a bit easier. It would feel more like those open world survival craft style games in the way they handle multiplayer. So kind of like Ark, just without any of the survival craft. You're going around hunting monsters, not trying to build forts. And the last thing that I would like to see has to do with the combat. I think Monster Hunter's peak combat is high rank Monster Hunter World. So for a person of my skill level, some of the faster monsters in Master Rank for World are extremely difficult. I think the difficulty balance is best at the end of high rank, where you're fighting the Elder Dragons. That to me is the sweet spot of Monster Hunter's difficulty, where it is at its most enjoyable, where it's still quite a challenge. If you make too many mistakes, you get absolutely wrecked. But at the same time, the monsters aren't as fast as the Master Rank ones, giving you a little bit of room to breathe between engagements. And that is something that is completely missing from Rise, where in Sunbreak, you have to play like a speedrunner in order to take out the high-level monsters. It's not quite that way in Iceborne, but it does still lean towards that direction. And personally, I find it quite annoying how the late game ends up, where you have to be incredibly optimized and have optimal gear to defeat the monsters that give you optimal gear, because that makes sense. So for me, I want the combat to feel like high rank in Monster Hunter World does. That kind of pacing of the combat. And get rid of wire bugs, man. Because in Sunbreak, Gunlance turned into a wire bug gimmick machine where you just click the button. And it was so annoying because there's no nuance to the combat. You just kind of wait out your opportunity and then just explode. Because that's all Gunlance was good for late game. And most of the weapons in Rise, they kind of get to where you use this one really strong option and ignore 90% of the kit. World handles that considerably better, where you actually have to use different options for different openings that you get. It's part of what makes the Monster Hunter combat so engaging, especially for Gunlance in Monster Hunter World. I find myself using pretty much every move that it has and finding a scenario to use every move. It is not like that in Rise or Sunbreak at all, and it's very annoying how late game Sunbreak just turns into spamming wirebug gimmicks against monsters that have 10 times the hit points of ones in World, where your hits feel considerably less significant against the monster compared to World, and generally just feels more speedrunny, arcadey style compared to World. So for combat, I want it to lean closer to World, but I want the peak late game to not be as fast-paced as Iceborne, especially Sunbreak. I would prefer the speed to be scaled back just a little bit, or just speed up the clunky weapons to compensate, which is kind of what they did for Gunlance in Rise, and they just turned it into a really gimmicky mess. I think it would be better for weapon balance to slow down monsters instead of speed them up. But I'm not somebody that has 10,000 hours in Monster Hunter games and is incredibly optimal and does those really hype speedruns you see on YouTube. I mean, as you can see from the background footage, I'm okay, maybe. I happen to think I'm fairly decent for the amount of hours I've put in. But as someone who's not that peak Monster Hunter player, those are some of the changes I would like to see. Just generally make the game a little more convenient, while also, in a way, make the combat a little, quote, easier. But by easier, I just mean make it feel slower than Monster Hunter Rise, but not quite as fast as the late game Iceborne either. So somewhere closer to high rank Monster Hunter World is where I would like kind of the peak pacing to be. And there are other ways you could keep the difficulty high there, but I find that speeding them up to make the difficulty higher gets annoying kind of quickly, and was especially annoying in Rise / Sunbreak. But anyway, that's enough rambling from me today. I'd like to know your perspective on what you think an ideal Monster Hunter game would look like. From my list here, I would like a Monster Hunter game that just feels like an open world that you set to multiplayer, your friends join, and you go on these grand expeditions through this massive open world, taking out the monsters that you see along the way with a less linear progression that does not require nearly as much of a grind to get proper gear, and is not the combat of Rise. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.